I think my microphone is working. Welcome to your final panel of the evening before drinks ensue and the sunshine can be absorbed. It is a very great honor to be here at the Chatham House event in a beautiful surroundings, and it is a very great honor to be sat in front of such wonderful panelists such as we have at the moment. I want to remind ourselves of who we have on the panel to be leading the discussion and leading you in your reaction and your questioning. It is Shaista Aziz, journalist and writer, you name it, she's been on it, CNN, Al Jazeera, but she's also, of course, worked with Amnesty International and the like. We have Mark Goldring, talking of Amnesty International, and talking of course, Oxfam Great Britain, chief executive thereof for the UK. And we have Orysia Lutsevich, manager of the Ukraine Forum, Russia in a Eurasia program of Chatham House, and Elif Shafak, author and the Weinfeld visiting professor, Oxford University, commuting less and less between Istanbul and London. But I want each of the panelists, before we start, to give a little bit of a detail about themselves, so you can really think about what's getting them going, what gets them up in the morning, what makes them passionate. But first, I want some audience participation, because what is this panel called? It is called Filling the Gap, Can Civil Society Drive Global Cooperation? Global cooperation, I mean, I've just come off air talking about the lack thereof, the fact that we have yet simmering tensions ever further between China and the United States. What do we do when we have less intergovernmental discourse? How can civil society drive a change? How can you make a difference? First of all, I therefore get some civil society action. I want some audience participation. Who agrees with the very statement of our panel? Do you think that civil society can drive global cooperation? I want to see a sea of hands. Who does think civil society can drive global cooperation? Oh, not many. Oh no, we have a few more. Not everyone is viewed. Let's take it to our panel, therefore. Shaista, talk to us first about what gets you out of bed in the morning, what makes you passionate, and whether you agree or don't agree with a statement.
Okay, so hi, good evening, everyone. It's really nice to be here. I think this is a very interesting question that we're posing, but you asked me, first of all, to explain what gets me out of bed in the morning. It's very clear for me what that thing is. It's injustice. So I spring out of bed quite quickly these days. But I've always been someone who has, I think, had quite a strong sense of justice and injustice as well. And this developed at a very young age. And partly it was to do with how I was raised. I come from a working class background. My parents are from Pakistan, so I'm a proud child of immigrants. And, you know, I was born and raised in Oxford, which has it's a very stunning city, as we all know. There's a lot of power there, there's a lot of wealth there, and there's a lot of class divide there as well. So from a very young age, I really understood quite a lot about power just by being born and raised in this beautiful city and kind of being pushed along by my mum and seeing these gorgeous buildings and sort of understanding over a period of time what it meant to live there and what that meant. So yeah.
And do you agree with the statement?
I believe that civil society is playing an increasingly important role, especially in activating solidarity. It's pushing, I think the people are beginning to feel that they, in pockets, have a stronger role to play. Mm-hmm. And even though a lot of people feel very powerless when they wake up every day and see the horrific news on the television, I think they're also starting to understand that we can't wait around for whoever they may be up at the top to provide all the solutions. Yeah. And so I think what I'm seeing increasingly is greater solidarity. And I just want to take just another quick minute just to explain that. So if we look at the so-called migration crisis, it's called often the Europe's migrant crisis. It's actually a refugee and a human rights crisis, a humanitarian crisis. I think it needs to be reframed. But I've spent a lot of time in Calais in the past couple of months, and what you see there is a lot of organizations, a lot of everyday people coming together, and what they're doing is plugging the gaps, which I don't think they should be doing, quite frankly, but nonetheless they're there, and they're showing solidarity, they're bearing witness, and I think that's very, very important. So I think that is one of the main things that civil society organizations are doing in terms of bearing witness, putting that information out, and challenging the status quo. And we've seen that with these children being locked up in cages in the US. We've seen the outrage, we've seen people coming together over that, and who knows if that's actually going to change government policy, but the sounds, at least, you know, Trump's making the right noises, so to speak, in relation to that. So I think that's just one example of that.
So Mark, tell us, everyone can of course go onto the app and see about the biographies of these wonderful panelists, but Mark, tell us what gets you out of bed in the morning at the moment, and whether you too agree with the statement that civil society can drive global cooperation.
Well, I certainly agree with the statement, but it has its limits. So first, let's celebrate that civil society can make an amazing difference to all of our lives and our worlds, and is doing so. It can't replace states. And it can't replace business, but it can make a difference to both, and it can make a difference on its own terms. So what got me out of bed this morning was that today Oxfam launched a campaign which is the result of years' research, working with civil society groups across the world, and we're looking at labor rights of the workers who are in the supply chains of the food that we buy for our supermarkets every day. And so as we look at what are our supermarkets doing in Britain, our colleagues in South Africa are looking at the role and rights of workers who are picking grapes on the farms there. Our colleagues in Thailand are doing exactly the same thing with the shrimp farming and the workers on the boats. So if that's part of a role of civil society, and an NGO is just one small part of civil society, but working with other organizations, that will influence government legislation in due course. First and foremost, we hope it will influence business practice, and it will make a real difference to the workers on the ground. So that's civil society having a role, not to replace governments, not to replace businesses, but to try and get the best out of all of them, and to take responsibility ourselves for the rights of people right across the world.
Mauricio, we're hearing from two panelists before you that it seems that, yes, we agree to the statement within limits. Give us a sense of what's getting you up at the moment, and whether you two agree with the statement.
Well, I come personally from Ukraine, and I've been here now for 7 years in the UK, and I've always actually been part of civil society sector as such, or set sector as it's called here, either on the donor foundation side, or now pretty much leading research on the Eastern Partnership countries and Ukraine and post-Soviet transition, as is driven by civil society. And we clearly see in my country, in other countries, Moldova, Georgia, civil society coming to a forefront with the civic tech, with the innovation. You know, frankly, on a personal note, my husband forbids me to talk about civil society at home, so I'm really pleased that I can be on this panel to share some of the views with you, because it's quite intense, because the subject of civil society is quite elusive. The moment you feel you grabbed it, and to me the main question that fascinates me, how do you really assess the impact of myriads of active citizens and organizations who are doing it on a daily basis with such determination, limited resources, and I think this is hopefully what I can contribute through my work with the colleagues in Chatham House, is trying to understand not just the structure of civil society, but how it can drive structural change. And here, maybe more than a footnote to the question is, yes, it can be a leader, but to really make a qualitative change for all those things we discussed, inequality, deterrence, education, it needs a partner. And the state has to be a collaborative partner. Unless this happens, societies, like in Ukraine, will be stuck in transition, or in the gray zone, on a low income, or in polarization, and they will not make this breakthrough.
And if you can contribute from not only what you view as civil society, but the action of culture and artists and authors within this. Can you give us a sense of what's making you passionate at the moment, and whether you agree that what the view is of civil society, whether they can make a change?
I think what gets me out of bed is... sorry, can you hear me? You can hear me? I'm a storyteller, so as writers, of course, we're very interested in stories, but I think we're also interested in silences, the things we cannot talk about, taboos, political, cultural, sexual taboos. So there's always a part of me that wants to question these things. But I believe for too long, writers coming from wobbly or wounded democracies like Turkey, Pakistan, Nigeria, Egypt, there's a long list. Many of us never had the luxury of being non-political. When politics is so urgent, it's so pressing. And also, I like the definition that one of the many wonderful things that feminisms of earlier generations taught us was that politics can be defined in a broader way, and the personal is also political. So when you describe it like that, I think it's quite difficult to be non-political. But what I'm trying to say is, in today's world, I believe we all live in liquid times in which none of us has the luxury of being non-political anymore. So it's not only those of us coming from wobbly lands, but all of us, East and West, we're in this together. Maybe because I come from a country in which civil society has been badly broken, damaged, bruised, systematically, year after year, for me, it's incredibly important. Of course, civil society is not going to replace the state or the business, not at all. But the robustness, the strength of the civil society will be incredibly important in terms of sustaining a democracy. Because now we know that for a democracy to survive, it's not enough to have relatively free elections, relatively regular elections. The ballot box in itself is quite fragile. In addition to that, we need a separation of powers, rule of law, definitely free, diverse media, independent academia, women's rights, LGBT rights, minority rights. Together with all these components, we have a breathing democracy. Now, if the components are bruised, the ballot box very quickly moves towards majoritarianism, which is completely different than democracy. And from majoritarianism into authoritarianism, it's a very short slide. So I believe for too long we have trusted too much technology. We thought technology was all going to bind us together. We were all going to become a big global village. There was so much optimism in early 2000s. We put so much trust in history. We thought history would always move forward. Tomorrow would be more progressive than yesterday. And we put trust in other actors than ourselves. But now is the time we need to put that trust in ourselves, because the energy to change must come from us, bottom up. And we're living in an age in which we have to hold politicians accountable. We have these populist demagogues, country after country, movement after country, and the quality of a civil society in a country is going to make a huge difference with regards to the future of democracy in that country.
Fascinating perspectives. I want to remind you, please do send questions from the app, get involved. I want to be seeing them on my trusty piece of technology that perhaps we trust a little bit too much nowadays, as you said. And also, we will be taking many a question from the floor, so I want much active participation. But Shista, you started by outlining some movements that you'd seen that had been a force, whether it was for good or for bad, but certainly had been there, and you're talking about the cages, the issue of the United States border at the moment. That's something people are rallying around. How are they rallying around if it's not just through technology, which perhaps, as Elif was saying, is something we can't trust so much in? We thought we were going to be a global community. Are we being? Where have you seen the positives of civil society coming together?
Well, I think there's a lot of positives, but I think this issue that you raised about technology is really interesting, because perhaps for, as you said, some of us don't have the luxury to not be political because our very existence is deemed to be political. But I think perhaps for some people in the West, technology has become a way of it's like an easy way of showing, clicking something or signing a petition online. It's some people think, well, that's enough, I've done my bit. That's a nice, non-messy way of showing that I care about something. But actually, we need to do much more than that. So you talked about the US border with Mexico. And so what's happening is a bit like when the Trump ban on refugees and the Muslim ban, people went to airports, they've gone to places where these children are being processed, and they've put their bodies there. They've come and they've stood in solidarity with the people who are being impacted, or in this case, children. And I find that very interesting. In places like Calais, where I've spent a bit of time, you have unaccompanied minors, you've got refugee children. I met one who was 14 years old from Afghanistan. He started talking to me. He was basically living in the woods, hiding. He could talk to me in Urdu, so we had a conversation in Urdu. And as I was talking to him, he had his hood up, and I suddenly realized that there was something not quite right with this child, and it really hit me very hard. And I'll tell you what it was. His hair was white. all of his hair was white. And I said to him, your hair is white. And he said, yes. He said, because I'm not a child. He said, I don't know what it means to be a child anymore. I've lost my childhood. I don't know what's happening to me. I have no idea what my life holds. And it was that was such a powerful thing that he said to me. I will never forget that forever. But what you have in places like Calais is you've got everyday citizens going out there to plug the gaps of the state and state actors by providing food, by providing solidarity. And some people say, well, this type of solidarity is not getting us anywhere. And some people also say that if do-gooders carry on doing that type of work, it means more and more of these people will come. Well, we have to ask ourselves why these people are coming in the first place. They're not coming, a child is not coming to hide in the woods for no reason. These types of solidarity movements, these types of actions are very powerful. If you look at the United States, Black Lives Matter as well. The way people are mobilizing and organizing themselves, feminists, the way they've been organizing themselves around Me Too. We don't have a movement, we have moments, I think, but what we need to do is sort of, I think, bring that solidarity together and join up the dots, connect all the oppressions and the systems of oppression that are impacting people, and there is a lot of connections there, and I think people are starting to do that, and they're using technology to do it, but they're also doing it offline as well.
Mark, how do you make sure that these moments don't just disappear without a trace when the media and social media has moved on to the next thing, and how does people going there, putting their bodies in the places which we said, going to Calais, help or hinder the work of organisations such as your own?
Well, I think what she's just said is really important about that personal action. You know, we know from British politics that 5 constituents going to see their member of parliament to talk about something is worth more than a petition with many, many more names on. That engagement makes a difference. And one of the things I'm really proud of that Oxfam's been putting a lot of work into is how do we get local civil society groups in war-torn countries in front of their leaders and world leaders who are actually helping to promote peace. So just the unseen activity that gets a women's group from Syria into the peace talks, if an international NGO can play a role in helping create the space for them to come, we're achieving something that's really powerful, because we know they won't get in otherwise, and women's voices won't be heard, civil society voices won't be heard. So I think it's that practical action, and it's also the continuation. Online, you can get millions of signatures, but they're here today and gone tomorrow. The group of people that keep day after day, like the campaigners for the arms trade treaty did, like the campaigners against apartheid did, over a long period of time, is involving civil society organizations, many of which don't have $1 in a bank account. They're just small local activists, right through to the big organized trade unions, political parties, NGOs. So it's that practical action over time, and it's the power of the personal. You put an individual in front of a leader, it makes so much more difference than a learned article.
And interesting, just for a follow-up for you there, Mark, because we've got a question from the audience from Juan Manuel Santos saying that civil society has a role to play without replacing governments nor businesses. But how can organisations, how can Oxfam, manage their funding to ensure their independence? Is that something that you have to question continually?
Well, Oxfam and funding is a big question at the moment. But if you look at an organisation like Oxfam, less than 10% of our funding comes from any single source, including the British government. So the important thing is to keep building the breadth of public engagement. So one of the things that horrifies us at the moment is losing public trust. Now, we did some things that deserved to lose public trust. We have to rebuild it. But the public trust is important, not just because that's your license to operate, but you also need lots of individuals to be saying, we want to be behind that. And then you don't rely on any single donor. No one is going to pay for a big campaign to make business fairer. It's just got to come from general individual donations. No government's going to stand up and support a campaign to reduce inequality. That's got to come from public support. So we need that broad-based public support, and that's why we don't take large sums from any one donor that allow our funding to be dominated.
Great question, keep them coming. Let's delve into the role of how you manage civil society with the government as well. And I mean, Rissi, this is something you're having to really debate within Ukraine at the moment. I mean, where are we starting to see the worlds align when you are starting to see the governments being able to be emboldened by what is happening from a civil society point of view, and where are they constricted?
Well, I think we must remember that we're dealing with the environments in flux. The country environment is in flux, the global environment is in flux, and civil society, in my region in particular, is trying to define that space where it belongs, where it has the right to contribute, where it has the right for civic oversight, where it has the right for genuine partnership. And one incredible example in Ukraine in the last 4 years has been the overhaul of the whole procurement system in Ukraine that is now receiving top global awards for transparency and fighting corruption. The solution for that came from the market, Transparency International, and one private funder who donated $30,000 for the first model of this open source software that is now simply rolled out across the board for all government agencies in just 4 years. So by looking at this example, and I think, personally, where we should focus is finding these bright spots of successful innovation that comes from the triangle of private sector, civil society, and government, and inspiring others. Because our challenges are growing, and but there are solutions, there are answers. So what we need is to scale up what is already working, and in our work we are trying to share those examples. And I would like to point to crowdfunding. Mm-hmm. The country like Belarus, out of all places, we just had the workshop on resilience of societies on Monday with colleagues from Belarus, Moldova, and Ukraine, and we said, what can we do, understanding that whatever threats we are facing are not going to go away. I mean, I understand we're all impatient to find a solution, but some big problems have no solution. So what we have to do is to accommodate to this permanent threat. And in Belarus, the crowdfunding, after the Western donors, a lot of them pulled out because of the closing space for foreign aid, citizens are donating a lot. And you would see projects like teachers, associations developing media literacy funded by citizens. And in Ukraine, the crowdfunding platforms, if you look at the top areas where citizens are donating, it's education, it's media projects, and it's human rights. Who would have thought? I mean, it shows about the maturity of the society.
Yeah.
And something that I think we all grapple is with, if you agree with the concept of the end of power, of the erosion of power, of the state, of corporations, of civil society in a way, because there are multiple causes, it's a cacophony of different aspirations, and it's hard for Oxfam, for others to mobilize those citizens to donate and to vote by their time and their funding. It means that we can use those, even crowdfunding efforts, governments can use them to monitor where the shortcomings are. If citizens are in a way replicating or doing what the government should be doing, shouldn't effective government call in some of those sectors and say, how do we improve the system? And then we can capitalize on the social innovation that is coming from the private sector, from the third sector, and ingrain it as part of the system. Maybe it's utopian, but that is what I really would like to see, these partnerships that will bring us a step forward.
With that, though, we need trust in the political elite and politicians. And there's a question for you, Elif, from Rotary Williams, saying that you've said this is a time where we can't afford to be apolitical ourselves, particularly coming from a bruised nation, as you mentioned, from yours. Yet it's also a time of low trust in politicians and politics. So where does the leadership come from? Where do you see leadership coming from in civil society?
Yeah, I think rather than expecting one person or one source, one institution to save us, I'd rather decentralize it. I don't trust any institution too much. Again, because maybe of my background, I think it's better when power is decentralized, diffuse, when many of us have more power rather than just one person or one institution. So rather than putting our trust in just one source, to be able to think that we as citizens also have power is just to reverse the entire paradigm and to say, I can make a difference if I can find the misinformation on Twitter that someone tweeted, you know, a picture, a tweet, if I can find the truth, I as a citizen can make a difference. Just to give small examples, I think we're living in an age in which journalism is incredibly important and unfortunately very much under attack. I'm talking about proper journalism. Everywhere, in all these countries like Turkey, but also to a certain extent Poland, Hungary, we see exactly the same example, and unfortunately there are very scary echoes of all of that in America today, attacking the press, attacking the media who dares to criticize people in power. So all of us have different degrees of power, and we might find ourselves in places that we never thought we would be. But that's important. That's why I believe in active citizens, and I believe in the kind of energy that comes from the bottom up. As a writer, for me, it's very important to be able to talk about stories, because I think one of the things that's systematically happening, whether we're talking about racism or sexism, any kind of ideological discrimination requires to dehumanize the other. If you can dehumanize the other, you can do anything to them. So it's not a coincidence that today, again on social media, all those jokes about minorities, about people of different color, anyone who looks differently, you know, all those jokes likening immigrants to animals, this is not a coincidence. You have to dehumanize. And we have to think, I think, how do I rehumanize the other? Because that is an act of resistance. To me, it is really worrying to observe that, unfortunately, oftentimes many populist demagogues unfortunately are much better than many people on the other side of the ideological spectrum, whether you call it left or liberal or progressives, whatever, but better than many people on the other side in terms of connecting with people's emotions. I think we need to talk about emotions. We live in an age in which anxiety, angst, anger, fear, resentment, bitterness, these things are incredibly important and yet underestimated in political science over and over, but they guide politics and they misguide politics. So I believe the challenge for us is, how do I connect with someone who votes differently, who thinks differently? Do I have the language to communicate with that person? This is going to be a massive challenge, not only now, but I think for the decades to come.
Is that something, Sjoste, that we need to have being thought of more in social media or in movements and on the ground? You talked of how people can make a difference by going, putting their body where they need them to be. But as you said, people, it's not enough just to tick something on a social media box and feel that you've achieved. But how do we turn this view on its head that civil society and each individual can do something by questioning and by rehumanizing with each other?
Well, I think the first thing is we need to teach compassion. I used to think that it was something that came naturally. I don't believe that anymore. I think we have to teach compassion, and compassion starts by being compassionate with yourself first, and then being able to be compassionate with other people. And then language. So, you know, I'm a journalist and a writer too. Language is deeply political, and often by actually identifying very clearly something by using a word to describe it, it becomes even more political. So part of the problem is that we as societies are sometimes, you know, the gatekeepers in society, the ones with the power, are unwilling to use accurate words to describe what's going on. So that's part of the issue as well. But I think when human beings reclaim their power, everyone has some power, everyone has agency, unless it's been removed from us. And, you know, there's different degrees of agency. I'm not saying everyone's equal, but I think that we do have some power, and when we tap into that power, when we acknowledge it, then it becomes a tool that you can use to galvanize people. So the other week, it was the 1-year anniversary of Grenfell, right? Now, this anniversary, thousands of people, I was there, I was amongst the people, were on the streets, and there was a silent march through Grenfell Tower and around the area, and it was silence can sometimes be deeply powerful. Silence can also be deeply damaging. I think I'm someone who gets anxious around silences when it comes to the deep injustice that's going on, because I feel that if there's too much silence, that's when the vacuum opens up, and things don't happen by accident. You know, the Donald Trumps of the world and the other types of governments that we have that are causing chaos, they don't just suddenly arrive. They arrive because of the language that's being used, the imagery that's being conjured up to describe different types of people, and they also arrive because of the silences as well. And so silence sometimes can be very powerful, like that tool of silence that was used for Grenfell. But frankly, I find it shocking that 1 year on, we are where we are with Grenfell, and there's the attempts for people to find justice they're far away. They're not getting any closer to that, but they will persevere because there is a strong movement of people who are backing their demands. But it will take time, so it's important then for that solidarity to keep going. We can't just let it drop off.
Yeah, Elif, I mean, you spoke of the power of silences and wanting to find those silences sometimes. And from the floor, there's a question from Sarah Campbell saying civil society is not monolithic. There's diversity in worldview, in mission and purpose. How do you facilitate that discourse? Is it through culture? Is it through art? I mean, how do we facilitate this from a global perspective?
Indeed, yes. Civil society, of course, is not monolithic.
And it can be uncivil.
It can be fragmented. However, I think we need to think about the concept of coexistence. What are the shared values that keep us together, and re-emphasize those shared values. And in my opinion, one of those shared values at the top, it has to be democracy, because we've taken democracy for granted for so long. I'm sorry, but especially in the West, in developed Western countries, because we thought democracy was a stage in history. When you arrive there, then you don't have to work or fight for human rights anymore, or women's rights anymore, because you're so over that stage. And some other countries can do that, but there's no need in those solid and safe lands. That perception of the world is broken now. So now we know that there's no such thing as solid lands versus liquid lands. We're all living in liquid times. So to emphasize, to understand that democracy is quite fragile, it's an ecosystem, and it requires to be nurtured constantly. We need to put effort in keeping it alive. But what kind of democracy? Pluralistic democracy. Yeah, the kind of democracy that reflects those voices, the diversity in civil society, not just one version. But for all of that to happen, we need to emphasize first coexistence, teach ourselves and our children empathy, communicate with our others, develop a language. I might be very critical of all these demagogues, but the people who voted in different ways, if I label them as my other, then this is lost. Because the only people who benefit from that kind of polarization, and I've seen this in Turkey again and again, if there's a duality in a country, and if there's a bitter polarization, the only people who benefit from it are the people at the top. They love that. They love to pit the society into two groups, one side versus another. So we have to break that us and them duality. And for that, I believe, yes, let's talk about differences, but let's talk about the commonalities as well, and let's understand how fragile democracy can be. And the second thing, if I may add, is to extend this kind of solidarity across borders. It's not only within the countries where we live, but beyond those national borders. It makes a huge difference for a cartoonist in Turkey, persecuted, or for a writer in China, or for a poet in Russia, if we show our solidarity. Just to say, I know you, I follow your story, you're not alone, has a huge impact. Maybe a silent impact, maybe we can't measure it, but I've seen it in my life. It has a big impact. So that kind of over borders, global solidarity and global sisterhood, I think is going to become more and more urgent.
And I just want to jump in and how can we, because I think it's indeed the problem of polarization and echo chambers that social media partially contributed. That's why I think civil society increasingly has to go offline, because in a way the mediums that we need is the face-to-face facilitated dialogue. And again, I come from the part of the world that was traumatized by the Soviet totalitarianism, where people shout at each other. The culture of dialogue, we take it for granted in the Western part of the world. But it's not, it's a special skill. It's education, it's the culture of this dialogue, it's acceptance, and it's a compromise. You know, compromise in the post-Soviet world is a dirty word. It means you're giving up. A lot of people are still in a zero-sum game. And I think, in a way, when we were discussing, you know, the globalization and the economic drivers of, and actually leading to populism, I think it's actually the crisis of democracy that led to populism, much more than globalization, because we increasingly get undemocratic liberalism, where people feel after elections the policies are not reflecting what they have voted for, and they don't have those mediums of real, you know, consensus building, policy consultations. And I think actually civil society can be a great remedy against populism if we go online, if we offer meaningful engagement. And even Chatham House, think about an organization. If we are looking for the global liberal world order, aren't we supposed to contribute to educating citizens of that order? A-level students, more universities. I think that could be, in a way, also a strategic priority for a think tank like Chatham House.
Let's get offline. Let's get questions from the audience, please, going. I particularly want to hear from Mark about, you know, what we have in terms of the non-political viewpoints. As we have a lady at the front here, we're just bringing you a microphone.
Hi, my name is Trisha de Borgra. The difference between going offline and online is, you know, it's an ongoing discussion, and obviously it depends on which country you're in. In a lucky democracy, in the sense that we take it for granted, and obviously it has its dangers. But in 50 or 60 countries of this world, government and business is the enemy of civil society. And in that case, there is no other option, because how do you grow? How do you make that space bigger and more resilient?
Would you like to tackle that?
Well, to me, it means go local, because even in countries like Belarus, we see at the local community level, local governance that is closer to people is looking for solutions. And if civil society comes with a constructive proposal to an educational, social, environmental issue, you could find common ground. Of course, I'm not idealizing, and of course there's confrontation and there are political prisoners and other issues. But I think increasingly what we see is antagonization for the sake of donor funding for different purposes. But I think we should start valuing cooperation a lot. And I think almost donors who are, I mean, I'm not talking about like human rights groups who are doing advocacy. This is a separate segment of civil society that, you know, is at the edge of this fight. But if you look at the wider segment, you can, in a way, prioritize this cooperation that is adding value. Because I think, you know, resources are limited, human resources are limited, and it's so important to pick out those fights correctly and to find those niches of opportunities where, you know, like you know, shortcoming in corruptions, for example, through the civic tech, you know, where you eliminate middlemen by using technology. You don't even need to have a direct contact with government. They are corrupt, they will be corrupt, but you shortcut this by using this technology.
Mark, there's an interesting question following up from that from the floor. Alvin Carpio from the fourth group saying, what is the most important lesson or piece of advice you would share with a new generation of community organizers to help them make real change happen? This is pertinent to you because you've just said that, of course, you're going to be exiting from Oxfam at the end of the year. What would your advice be to the next generation?
Well, I think Oxfam's just one small player in this. I think much more important are the small local organizations that answer the questions you were just talking about, the ones that are carving their own space. So at the level of international NGOs, that's just one small bit of it, I think the real issue is the evolution in how do you support these movements. Because the movements aren't homogenous. We work a lot on inequality. Everybody in the room's got a different view on which bit of inequality needs to be worked on and what that looks like. But what can we do to support that is, I think, a big issue where international NGOs aren't yet good enough. If we look at traditional international NGO work, so much of it is the small development project, and you put them all together and you've still got lots of small development projects. You haven't got system change. Whereas if we can find better ways of supporting local organizations, offer the solidarity that you were talking about, the international links, the space for them to express themselves, we'll actually be doing something that's really valuable and relevant. So what I'd be encouraging the leaders to do is to say, what's the role of a northern organization or an international organization in supporting local organizations to actually to be brave, because they're the ones that have to be brave, to be strong, to actually be able to get the evidence where we can sometimes help them to build their picture, to offer the linkage internationally and nationally. And then to the local organizations, the real challenge is that closing civil society space, which is a paradox. We have more countries holding elections and less space for civil society in many countries at the same time. So to navigate that together feels like the real challenge for tomorrow.
I mean, someone's saying, you know, were we placing too much responsibility on civil society?
Yes, I said that, I think at the beginning, that I don't think it's the role of civil society. For example, we've got growing inequality in the UK. There's more children now whose families are depending on food banks than ever before. There's a term called the just managing. We're very good in England in terms of using language to hide things and not really describe what's going on. So, I think it's shocking, there you go, there's that word again, that, organised everyday people are kind of plugging those gaps. So I'm from Oxford, and in Oxford we have a growing homeless crisis, as we do around the country. There's lots of reasons for that, but during the last 7 years of austerity, visible homelessness, rough sleeping has definitely gone up. We can see it around this beautiful hotel as a start. And what we've got the students at the University of Oxford handing out food to people who are rough sleeping, and we've also got community projects running in our city where every 2 weeks the community comes together and they bring lots of food and they sit down and they eat with people who are experiencing homelessness. Now, while I think this is a very, very important thing in terms of building solidarity and in terms of people understanding each other's reality and empathy and all of that, this is 2018, we're the 6th richest country in the world. Oxford is one of the richest cities in the whole of the United Kingdom. It's one of the most expensive places to live, and this is what's going on. We've got volunteers coming to feed people who have nowhere to live because services have been cut, and austerity and all the rest of it. This is not acceptable. It's as simple as that. We cannot expect everyday people to be plugging these gaps. I think the role of civil society, the most powerful role, is, like I said, connecting people and being able to distribute money and basically trying to tip the balance. So those University of Oxford students, by the way, the university accused them in 2 weeks ago, I think it was, they were accused of actually sort of fueling homelessness by their compassion. That was a statement that came from the university in an email, which then went viral, and it was in the Guardian, and it was here and there. And it's like, well, that's quite extraordinary that people who are being compassionate, young people in our country who are outraged at what's going on, are then being accused of fueling a crisis such as homelessness. The same thing happens with refugees and migrants. In Europe, people have been arrested because they've gone out to give food to migrants. They've gone out to give food to refugees. They're just not willing to sit back and watch those people suffering. But it is actually the role of the state to do that, and we have to hold them accountable, and we must hold them accountable. So I think a lot of these things can be done in parallel. And I think your point about opening up space is the key to this. So the biggest role I think we should play in terms of civil society in the West, where perhaps we might not be as under siege as other parts of the world, is to amplify the voices of people, amplify the realities of people, and to share our resources where we can, and to make sure that the stories that they're telling are heard, and the right people, i.e. the people with power, hear those stories as well, whether they want to or not. Let's amplify a few more voices. Yes, straight up here in the front if we can. And then we'll take one from the gentleman at the back. Your name and where you're from, please, first.
Hey, I'm Christina from the Center for Feminist Foreign Policy. Shaisa, I have a question for you, if that's okay. So you are involved in intersectional feminist foreign policy as well. And feminist foreign policy at its core has a human security focus instead of national interest in foreign policy. So, and advocating for a feminist approach to foreign policy beyond Sweden and Canada, it is a really activist undertaking. So I'm wondering, what is your advice? What can civil society do to advocate for this approach more effectively and to actually tell European states for them to deem it necessary to stand up to bullies like Trump, not only when he wants to impose tariffs, which is the national interest thing again, but even when he detains babies and toddlers?
Well, I think we've covered quite a lot of it already, and that is show open solidarity. If your point about the other side, if you want to call them that, being very good at selling their message and tapping into people's emotions, I think we need to become far less apologetic about being outraged, about feeling horror at what's going on, and then actually showing open solidarity with those individuals who are being impacted and saying, no, we're not going to tolerate this. We need to do that louder, and we need to connect with each other's human stories louder as well. We all have connections as human beings, and I think, you know, there's a fear sometimes. People sometimes feel scared to connect, because when you've connected, then you can't just pretend that you've not felt something. You know, you can't pretend that you didn't understand that human being, you know? So I think sometimes there's a little bit of fear there. But your point, just very quickly, about intersectional feminist foreign policy, again, it's very straightforward. We need to ask ourselves, when we're in a room, who's missing from that room, and why are they missing? It's not because they don't want to be there, it's because they've not been allowed into that space. It's because they've not been invited to be around the table. And what we have to simply do is open up space. But again, opening up space is very political. So when it comes to women and foreign governments and you know, NGOs as well, often because of the way they have to get funding in and the way they have to account for it, they will perhaps speak to women who only speak English, for example, women who've been educated in certain places. This whole issue of secularism, that comes into play as well. And it very much impacts then the type of women that you're able to engage with. And it may be that it's not actually the women who, it's not really the bigger group of women, it's a smaller group of women. That doesn't mean you don't talk to those elite women or whatever, however you want to describe them, but you have to work harder at reaching out to the majority. And you need to also get beyond your own prejudices, and you have to get beyond your assumptions, and that's difficult, but it has to be done, because otherwise you're failing. So I think those are some of the practical things that can happen, or that you can do, I should say.
Fascinating perspective. Yes, there's a gentleman at the back there with his hand up.
Thank you so much. My name is Yuri Tsarik. I'm from Belarus, representative for an NGO think tank, Center for Strategic and Foreign Policy Studies. Thank you for your very inspiring presentations. You've talked a lot about the bright side of civil society, but I would like to ask a question about the dark side of it. By which I mean such dimension as civil society organizations serve vested interests rather than common good in return for financial incentives, or literally being bought off by some of the actors, which is the case with Russia-backed civil society organizations in the Eastern Partnership area, but also in EU increasingly, and even the United States of America probably. So who do you think should play the leading role in dealing with this issue, civil society itself or the state, or what could be the cooperation between the two, or between civil society organizations in different countries with regard to this issue? Thank you.
Rusia, do you want to, or Elif as well?
Because I think if we are talking about various crises, we all represent here civil society, we can say, talk about our own crisis. And I think there is a crisis of legitimacy. In views of many, you know, some people say you're just grant eaters, or you're just serving Western interests, you aren't really addressing the issues of the needs of the populations. And then, of course, you have increasingly states co-opting weaponizing civil society through different gone-goes and finding an entry point into democratic systems. And with this, my answer would be transparency and accountability and awareness that this happens can already help a lot. Of course, in case of Ukraine, for example, some of those Russian gone-goes that are spreading disinformation are sanctioned. You can then have more harsh response to this. But I think crisis of legitimacy is something that we all have to think about, because if 5 citizens come to a local member of parliament, they represent their constituency, but if 5 think tankers and experts come, the question is, who do you represent? And what kind of leverage you have? Did you consult with how many people? Which professional group do you represent? I think that's a very valid point, and as other fields are getting co-opted, civil society field is also getting co-opted, and we should be aware of that.
I think to think about the social media might also be useful in terms of understanding the complexity of civil society and how social media itself can be a bit like the moon. You know, it has a bright side, we've been talking about it, a bright side that so many people had high hopes on for many years, but it also has a dark side, and we are seeing more and more of that. And again, coming from a country like Turkey, on the dark side, for me, the social media means lots of slander, misinformation, but systematic. I'm talking about systematic slander. Also trolls, like thousands of trolls organized. If you happen to be critical of the government, all of them attacking at the same time, the same week. And if you happen to be a woman, the language the trolls use is much more sexist. And the next week they move on to someone else, like flocking birds, because next week they're attacking someone else. So it's quite systematic. And you see all of that, and you see lots of hate speech, particularly the kind of hate speech that targets minorities, individuals, people who do not have equal power as the state. For me, the way, as far as I'm concerned, you should be able to say whatever you want about the state or politicians who are already in positions of power. But if it's the kind of hate speech targeting people who are vulnerable and who do not have any power, that's a different story. So in Turkey, it's the other way around, for instance. We always protect the state from the views of individuals. Even though the state is robust, we treat it as if it was made of glass. What do we do? I mean, is it possible to say, okay, I'm not going to be on social media anymore? I don't think so, because again we come back to the bright side. It does have an amazing transformative potential, because it is much more egalitarian than many conversations we're having. It has the potential to connect us across borders. And again, coming from the Middle East, I have seen how the social space, public space, sorry, in country after country across the Middle East has been predominantly in the hands of men, especially when you travel the cities. The streets belong to men, public squares belong to men, particularly after certain hours. But so more and more, there's a systematic backlash against women, telling us our primary space is the house. But I know many young women, many young Muslim women in the region who see the social media as an alternative public space. And for them, it's incredibly important to have a Facebook account or a Twitter account. It might not mean too much for us, but it means something to them. And for countries where the freedom of expression is under threat, oftentimes, social media is much more politicized. So people do not necessarily talk about movies or food. It's a political platform. So I think it's a good metaphor. I mean, obviously there are lots of dark sides in both social media and civil society at large, but the potential is there. And for us, I think to kindle that potential, we need to connect the dots, and we need to talk about human rights and democracy and shared values and try to push it forward rather than to discard it aside.
And I think, like in any industry, there can be a self-regulation of the leaders who will set up certain standards and tones and quality for services and for other assurances. And I'm sure that in more Western democracies, you have leaders like that can come and put more better barriers to entry for, politically oligarchic, gongo type of organizations, and build that awareness. And I think that is very important, so that organizations themselves drive the ethics bar.
Mark, you were looking to say something.
Yeah, well, just adding one dimension to that, we have another driver that's really affecting the way that international support to all of this works. The level of global regulation and restriction, whether it's around money laundering, counter-terrorism, bank transfers, all of that are donor compliance issues. All of that's making it much harder to work with fragile, smaller organizations, which risks forcing you into the arms of the big government-backed organizations. I can't offer any simple answer. We're really struggling with it because there's one side that says work with grassroots, and then there's a 50-page checklist which includes their last 63 years' accounts and this approval and that regulation and everything else. So we're struggling with that dilemma, which means we've got to find more creative ways of engaging, and the social media, the solidarity, the networking is all part of that, but it doesn't replace the need to also work on the practical, and we're not doing very well at that at the moment.
Can I ask, sadly, as our time has come to a halt, for an optimistic tone from each of you, can you give us a call to arms, make us empowered as we leave for our first day of the Chatham House Royal Institute for International Affairs event? What can we go and do as members of civil society starting today?
Well, I feel very optimistic because so much is happening. I mean, obviously so much horror is happening as well, but things are happening things are happening so fast that we're barely able to catch our breath, and that is a sign that power is shifting, perhaps not in the way that we necessarily want it to, but there's a lot of change taking place. And activists around the world, I'm very fortunate that I've connected with a lot of good ones. They're way ahead of the curve. They're doing exceptional work. They're very brave, as you've already said. So I feel very hopeful about that. And I also feel that there's a growing movement of people coming together, because as we said at the beginning of the conversation, nobody's coming to save us. We cannot wait and for some sort of mythical leader to come along and lead us to the promised land. It's just not going to happen. At local level, I've recently been elected as a councillor in Oxford, and I'm seeing increasingly how groups are coming together on the in local communities, because there's no money, because all the budgets have been slashed. They're having to become more creative and more resourceful, and they're also kind of connecting. So in terms of Oxford, the University of Oxford, massive prestigious institution, lots of money, etc. So all those links and all those connections, people are starting to become more creative. And so I think that's really positive. And so all I'd say is, it goes back to what you said, be an active citizen. Every single one of us, we should be active citizens, and we should not be apologetic about that. And I've used this word many times, but this word, solidarity, active solidarity, is one of the most powerful, transformative things in the world. And again, perhaps we don't really, all of us don't fully understand the power of that, but I would say tap into that. Whatever your passion is, whatever that one thing is, just go and tap into it, and keep tapping into it, and just keep conversations going, and reach out to people who perhaps you've never spoken to before. Just do it.
Mark, give us a call to arms.
What better example of active solidarity than that amazing U-turn in American politics with separation of children in the last 24 hours. Now, whoever knows what caused it, some people will be much closer. But I think often with big social movements, anyone who claims success as opposed to claims to being part of something is really overstating it. But the important thing there is, it wasn't formal democracy. It wasn't a vote in the House. It was family pressure, it was party pressure, it was international pressure. There was messages happening all over the world. And the great thing on the news today was not only the story of the reverse, but that story that he had actually had to listen to public opinion, which was to me, a sign, well, if it can happen with Trump, it can happen in most places.
Well, to me, I would like to wrap up with what we've started by Marie-Louise Beck this morning, mentioning about trust. And I think if we think about the third sector across the world, and I think in many countries, definitely in Ukraine and the UK, for sure, it has more trust than governments. And this is a very precious currency. And I think the third sector shouldn't be too egoistic about hoarding the trust, but we should think about how in a smart way we can share it in the society. Because if we don't share it, I don't think we can travel too far.
Elif?
I think I'm half pessimistic, half optimistic. I like Gramsci's approach. He talks about the pessimism of the mind and the optimism of the heart, of the will. And I think we have reasons to be pessimistic. When we look at what's the political landscape across the world, and I'm afraid we're going to see more of that in Europe as well, in continental Europe. We're going to see more of this, because populism, it affects countries that are crisis-ridden like Greece, but also relatively wealthy, prosperous like Sweden. You know, country after country, we see similar trends of tribalism, isolationism, and we shouldn't think that we're much more solid, because sometimes it takes one financial crisis or one emotional crisis to just tip the balance in a very different direction. And we live in that kind of volatility, I believe. So there is reason to be pessimistic, but there is also reason to be optimistic when we look at people, when we talk to people, when we connect with people, especially women, young people, you know, minorities, people from very different parts of the world. And for me, that's the reason why we need to be very clear about our values, and we shouldn't suppress our voice when it comes to human rights. We shouldn't negotiate these issues. We shouldn't give the impression that these are postponable issues, doesn't matter that much. They do matter. So let's be very critical of governments, whether it's our own government, someone else's government. We're all global citizens. We can talk about each other's stories. That's also fine. But let's be very critical about governments that violate human rights, violate democracy, freedom of speech, but at the same time connect with people. Because the moment we isolate countries wholesale, the only people who will benefit from this will be the isolationists. You know, and that's a distinction that I find very important. We can do both at the same time, critical of its politics, but connect with the people whose voices have been suppressed anyhow. I'm just worried that if we leave those gaps get wider and wider, then it will become a much worse world.
Let's narrow those gaps. Before we all head out for a drink and start speaking person to person, we're going to hear from Robin about what you can expect tonight and tomorrow. Thank you very much.
Well, Matt, just hold your applause for 1 second. I think that was just an absolutely super panel, and I think you'll agree with me. It was really a great conversation, and what I want to do is just remind you that we're going to break from this, go and have drinks upstairs. There's a bit of a terrace up there as well for those of you who can get to it first. Because it's just a gorgeous evening, like we've not had at one of our London conferences before. And then what you're going to do is we'll be coming back down here for those of you who've signed up for dinner, who want to come to dinner. You're all invited, but some of you I know can't make it. But dinner is going to be held miraculously in this room. So when you come back down, the little bell will ring, you will have dinner here, and we're going to have the opportunity to hear from Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie, who will be in conversation this evening with Sophie Walker, and we're going to be able to have, I think, a very good and pleasant evening after a very hard work day. And my last other point, which will get repeated at the end of dinner as well, tomorrow morning we have a whole bunch of breakout breakfasts, but they are first come, first served. So if you saw something you liked, make sure that you're here. Registration 8:15, breakfast is 8:30, and then the main program starts after that. 9:45. But I know most of you will be there bright and early for some breakfast with us. We've got a whole slew of different, very fascinating topics. But that will be after we've digested a really full day, and I think we could not have had a better way to finish it. A panel of real energy. Caroline, thank you for moderating it so well and getting the best out of a great panel of panelists, especially at the end of a long day. And I thought really mobilizing, motivating, and very powerful comments. I really want to thank Caroline. I know you would have done it, but on behalf of these four, strong hand. Thank you.